Welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be looking at organic molecules now that we have an idea of what atoms are and how they bond with one another in order to make molecules. So the first topic I'm going to talk about in terms of organic molecules is just giving you an overview of what the heck they are in the first place so that we can then talk about the different types of organic molecules in the subsequent lectures this week. Alright, so first things first, what the heck is an organic molecule? Well, an organic molecule is any molecule that contains a carbon. And all organic molecules have at least one carbon, and we eat organic molecules all the time, every time we sit down at the dinner table. There are 4 types of organic molecules we're going to learn about. Carbohydrates, or sugars, lipids, which are things like oils and fats, proteins, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So first things first, what is it about carbon that makes it so ubiquitous or so commonly found in organic molecules? Well, carbon has a very stable structure. And if you remember, carbon has 6 electrons. The first 2 are located in that inner energy field, and then the remaining 4 are smattered around the outside of the carbon in the next energy shell. And if we were to bond this carbon with hydrogens, you would see that the hydrogens pull equally on that carbon in all 4 directions. So the carbon is getting pulled on in all directions equally, and the end result is that we don't get any areas of partial positive or partial negative charges. We get a very stable molecule, which is a good type of molecule to have if you want to make a living organism. You don't want to make a living organism out of highly unstable molecules that are going to degrade or decompose very readily. Carbon can make single, double, and triple bonds. We'll talk more about double and triple bonds briefly when we get to talking about lipids. The other neat thing about carbon is that it can form very long chains with itself. In fact, you can make molecules that are almost infinitely long. These long chains of organic molecules are commonly seen. For example, potato plants make this type of organic molecule called starch, and starch is extremely long chains of glucose molecules joined one to the other. Our livers inside our own bodies make a version very similar to starch called glycogen. And this molecule, glycogen, is also long chains of glucose molecules strung together, but rather than being just long straight chains, there are also side chains. So it's highly branched molecule, but it's the same idea as starch. Now, these long chains are formed through a process called dehydration synthesis. You need to know this. Anytime I have 2 individual organic molecule units, or what we call monomers, those monomers, one of the monomers will end in a hydroxyl group, which is a fancy way of saying it ends in an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. The other monomer will end in a hydrogen group. Notice if I take that hydrogen and that hydroxyl group and remove them, I've created water. That's the dehydration part. And if I remove that hydroxyl and hydrogen group, these 2 monomers are left to grab onto each other and form a bond. They form a polymer doing that. Now, to reverse that process, I undergo something called hydrolysis. Hydro means water. Lysis means to split apart. So literally, I'm using water to split apart a polymer. So I have a polymer, I add water to it, and I end up getting 2 individual monomers. It's exactly the opposite of what we did in dehydration synthesis. Hydrolysis is what happens when we digest food. Last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll launch into specifics on each of the 4 types of organic molecules, are these things called functional groups. Carbon atoms can have attached to them different groups that you will repeatedly see over and over again. They're very common groups of atoms, and so I want you to be familiar with just a handful of these so that you know what they are. The first one is one I just mentioned, the hydroxyl group. That's an oxygen bonded with with a hydrogen. Anytime you see an oxygen with a hydrogen, you're going to have those partial negative and partial positive charges, and as a result, you're guaranteed to have a very polar molecule that can form hydrogen bonds. Another group you should be comfortable with are the carbonyl group, and this is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. Again, because there's an oxygen present, we can expect to have partial negative charges here, and as a result, you're going to have a polar molecule. The carboxyl group is the next one. This one you commonly see, and I'm going to mention it in a little bit when we discuss proteins and amino acids. This is when you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and then single bonded to an oxygen and a hydrogen. Remember again that this is called the hydroxyl group, but when we have it all together like this, we call it a carboxyl group. We see these very common in acids, and again, because we see oxygens bonded to hydrogen and we see oxygens alone, expect to see that this is a very polar molecule. Another group that we will commonly see that you need to be familiar with is the amino group, which is a nitrogen bonded to two hydrogen. It also tends to be highly polar. We get partial negative and partial positive charges in this molecule, just like we do kind of in a water molecule. I'm not going to really have you worry too much about the sulfohydryl functional group, but I do want you to be familiar with the phosphate group, which contains a central phosphate double bonded to an oxygen, and then it's got some hydroxyl groups on it. And by the way, anytime you see the letter R, like you see here, these R groups just mean any old other type of molecule that could be bonded on there. It's usually some sort of carbon-based molecule. In this phosphate, again, because we see oxygens bonded with hydrogens and double bonded oxygens, again, expect it to be highly polar and therefore make hydrogen bonds. All right, that is a very, very quick overview of the functional groups. The next part of the lecture, we're going to start out talking about carbohydrates.